I think the funniest meme that came out of your channel was your family suffered under communism. Why should I care? Like,
I still don't care.
that was so funny.
Under BRG's communism, your family's not going to suffer. Your family is going to have plenty of food and a nice job. So I love Wall Street. As a matter of fact, I watched it for the first time in high school, and I wanted to be an investment banker all throughout my sophomore and junior year. Yeah, we narrowly missed finance bro Black Red Guard. You know what stopped me?
You're going to get canceled in the Cultural Revolution once they do you have bourgeois tendencies.
You know what stopped me from becoming an investment banker? I realized that you need to do calculus, and I hate math with a passion. I don't know if you've read any of the stuff from the Peruvian Maoists, but like Gonzalo gets into that a lot too. If you wonder why the Red Guards were so weird, or if you've ever run into any of those people that are obsessed with the Peruvian Maoists, like it's very, very cult sounding. That's how I would describe it. It's like, we must cross oceans of blood. And I'm like, okay, you're ripping this out of the context of the Andes, where talk like that is normal. And you're trying to impose it in the United States or in Canada or in Germany, where when you sound like that, people are going to assume that you're some type of crazy cult. And I just don't fucking get it. Like,
I saw protests of Gonzaloites in Norway.
Like,
talking about long live Gonzalo in fucking Norway.
It's funny to me. Like, you really think that you're going to initiate a protracted people's war in fucking Norway? One of the happiest countries in the world. Like, these people literally get checks, oil money checks from their government, and you're going to initiate a protracted people's war. They're going to be like, protracted people's war for what? We're happy. We get money from the government. We get hospital free. Why war? Make love, not war. If you do not want the revolution, you must share the oil money.
Do you think Louis Farrakhan's a fascist?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I wasn't expecting you to say yes. Because I was about to be like, that would contradict your point, but actually, no, you don't.
That's why I said yes.
I wouldn't say he's a fascist. I think he's just a reactionary. But
no, like, if you know anything about the Nation of Islam, like, they have a subordinate role for women. They're very, very keen on small business ownership. They have some damn good food, though. But no, that's why, like, Elijah Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, he literally invited Nazis to attend the meeting. George Lincoln Rockwell, if you've ever heard of him, the founder of the American Nazi Party. And it's literally a picture of him sitting surrounded by all these black people looking like this.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with BRG, known as Black Red Guard, somebody who some of you who have Twitter might recognize if you've been anywhere around the communist or leftist Twitter space. BRG has had a few tweets go viral, but more importantly, he's known for his YouTube videos and his organizing, particularly with the DSA. And that's kind of what might be controversial about you, is that you are a self-described Maoist who is part of the DSA and advocates trying to work to some extent within the DSA, and that is controversial within communist circles. I'm trying to expand the ideological diversity of this channel, get on some like anarchist perspectives, Maoist perspectives. And I know a lot about Maoism as you know, like I had my Cultural Revolution video, which you read a quote for, which was nice. Although I'm not a Maoist myself, but I think, and I say this with full sincerity, I think Black Red Guard's one of the very few sane Maoists I know. Then again, I don't know a lot of Maoists in real life. Most of them are on Twitter, but I think they're pretty level-headed and make a lot of sense. But without further ado, what is a Maoist doing in the DSA? Why are you a Maoist and why are you in the DSA? I know, two massive questions. Choose whichever one you want to tackle first.
It's obvious why I'm a Maoist in the DSA. There's a lot of naive young white people to brainwash. Anyway. Well, what's up, Tony? Thanks for having me on. So why am I a Maoist in the DSA? Well, a bit of my organizing history, for the past 10 years. Okay, so I would say that I became a Maoist in probably late 2015, early 2016. And if you know anything about the Maoist movement in the United States, at least in Canada, you guys had a Maoist party, which ended up collapsing, the RCP. Down here, we don't have a Maoist party. I mean, we have one party that has a Maoist history, the RCP. We're very creative when it comes to names, in case you haven't noticed that. So the Maoist movement in the United States is very scattered. And you mentioned that a lot of us spend more time on Twitter than in actual real life organizing. The Maoist movement in the United States is extremely online. And so my own personal organizing history, I helped found a bunch of Maoist or Mao-influenced groups for the people, the organizing committee for a Maoist Communist Party, a bunch of other groups whose names I forgot. And if you forgot the name of your organization, probably didn't do all that much. So just bouncing around from silliness to silliness. I mean, there were some good experiences. One thing that Maoists are very heavy on is theoretical education and preparation. I think a lot of people would dare say that we are too focused on that. But a lot of the stuff that goes on in DSA, we're still arguing over whether or not voting for Kamala Harris is a good thing. As a Maoist, I knew that voting for a Democrat was kind of stupid in 2016. I was never a Bernie bro or any of that stuff. So why am I in DSA? Because DSA remains the largest socialist organization in the United States. And if we are to apply the mass line, which basically means that you go to the people, you find out what the people want, you find out what the people are willing to do, you find out what's going on with the people, you analyze this through your understanding of Marxist Leninism, Maoist theory, and you present this back to them in a line. If our goal is to organize the socialist movement in the United States in a Maoist direction, then it's kind of silly to try to inoculate ourselves from revisionism by remaining in a bunch of tiny pseudo-adventurist book clubs. None of these things have moved even remotely in the direction of the formation of a party. They spend more time squabbling with each other than they actually do organizing the people. Maoists in the United States, we have done some good things. We're pretty strong in tenant work. And we're pretty strong in helping to build rank and file caucuses within unions. But in terms of actually building unity and acquiring a mass base, we tend to suck at that. Why do we tend to suck at that? Because we're sectarian as hell, and we would much rather fight with large groups of people that call themselves socialists and actually try to integrate ourselves into these people. So why did I join DSA? It's not entryism, actually. It's because, well, for one, my old org kicked me out after I joined DSA. So it's not like I have anywhere else to go. But it just doesn't make any sense to me to continue to remain isolated from the largest organization of socialists in the United States. Are there problems theoretically and praxis-wise in DSA? Of course there are. There's problems theoretically and praxis-wise in every left-wing organization. But it's idealist to think that these problems are just going to go away without struggling with them. One thing about Maoists is that we are firm believers in open and above board struggle. So yes, there are people who could be defined as liberals in the DSA. There are people who can be defined as all sorts of things in the DSA, but avoiding, again, the largest organization of socialists in the United States, simply because there are some people that you disagree with. It's a very, very juvenile way to do politics, in my opinion. Why am I a Maoist? Because all of the people that I learned from, Malcolm X, he was an admirer of Mao Zedong, the Black Panther Party. I wouldn't call them Maoist because Maoism, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism proper did not exist, but the Black Panther Party was an anti-revisionist, Mao Zedong thought-inspired party. Huey actually went to China after he got out of prison, and he loved it.
Huey Newton,
Robert F.
those who don't know.
Yeah, Huey Newton, Robert F. Williams, the guy who wrote Negroes with Guns. And as a Negro with guns, I really look up to Robert F. Williams. He actually spent a large part of his exile because he was run out of the country by the FBI because he was accused of kidnapping some white people. He was actually trying to keep them safe. But you try to help white people, then you really don't like it. So he was run out of the country. He first went to Cuba, but he started criticizing the Soviet government, which the Cubans didn't really like. So he was basically kicked out of the country, and he ended up in China, where there's actually a very, very good picture of him with Chairman Mao getting his little red book signed. So Maoism and Black revolutionary nationalist praxis in the United States got to go hand in hand.
Well, I want to go very deep into the weeds of Maoism, but first, with the case for the DSA. So you don't think that the answer is to build a new anti-revisionist sect and somehow try to spread it within all 50 states, the biggest or third biggest country in the world?
You've been trying to do that for 50 years. All it's produced is the RCP.
I think it's worth breaking that down because you use these terms and sometimes I always forget like people exist who aren't as immersed in this as we are. But you mentioned anti-revisionist, revisionist. What does this mean? And I guess you could tie that into like why you're a Maoist, because it's not an obvious question actually. What is revisionism? I think like you could probably say it's just distorting Marxism and particularly abandoning class struggle if you were to use the most general definition of revisionism. But I think within what is revisionist, I think it's complicated, right? Because you brought up the RCP in Canada. Well, Canada has all sort of weird niche infighting with communist groups because you're aware of the Communist Party ML, which is like Hoshist.
Yeah, that was Harjo Baines' old outfit, wasn't it? Like, doesn't he have like a grave site and a bunch of his comrades are buried around him or something?
I've never been there, so I'm not exactly sure.
No, she could see. But yeah, what is revisionism? What is anti-revisionism? I mean, I guess the answer you would get to that question depends on who you ask. Like if you ask a Hotchite, they will say that Maoists are revisionists, even though they spent Mao's and like during the period when Mao was the leader of China, they basically spent like boatloads of fucking ink and killed shitloads of trees riding his dick. Then after he died, he was like, you know what? This guy was a revisionist all along. So I don't know. Why would Hacha be following a revisionist? I don't know. But Hacha wasn't the brightest Albanian in the goat shed. Anyways.
You made the distinction between Mao Zedong thought and Maoist. That's worth clarifying because it's not the same, right? Like what Mao was doing in China wasn't Maoism.
No.
Maoism comes much later. That's like worth clarifying, right?
So there's a difference between a thought and an ism. A thought is basically the application of the prior ism to the specific conditions of a country. For example, when we speak of Gonzalo thought, we're not speaking of something that has been codified and is universal. So what does universal mean? Because like, I know absolutes suck, but like there are certain experiences. For example, we all acknowledge the contributions of the Russian Revolution and the socialist construction experiment in the Soviet Union, which we call Marxism-Leninism. So when we talk about a thought versus an ism, like I've never heard of any Lenin thought or anything. I guess you could call it Leninism, but basically
Leninism.
Yeah. I guess the Russians didn't think much. Anyways, So when we talk about a thought, we talk about the specific applications of Marxism-Leninism or Marxism-Leninism, Maoism to a particular country. So when we talk about Mao Zedong thought, we're talking about the applications of Marxism-Leninism to the concrete conditions of the Chinese Revolution, the Civil War, the war against the Japanese, in the socialist construction project of the 60s and 70s, and the new democratic project of the late 40s, early 50s. So all of that was analyzed, and through these practices, the experiences of the Cultural Revolution, which you did a dope ass video on, etc. A lot of people attribute the development or the synthesis of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism to the Peruvians. Personally, I think that kind of slights the Filipinos and the Indians, both of which
Yeah, I
had
thought it
their
was the
own.
Indians, the Naxalites, who kind of synthesized Maoism. That was my understanding.
Honestly, I think it was all three. And you also, if you've read George Jackson, he actually called himself a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist like 10 years before Gonzalo even popped off. So, and like that whole, like people want to have this whole linear reading of things. It's a lot more complicated. And a lot of like Maoists are not really good at nuance. But I think that you have to analyze every revolution that was waged after the Chinese Communist Party took over China. And I would venture to say that the Filipinos and the Indians and the Peruvians, these three experiences together help synthesize Maoism. So going back to the question, what is revisionism? What is anti-revisionism? Revisionism, I would define as the line of the ruling class, the line of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie in the communist movement or in the socialist movement being broader. Stuff like ideological commitment to voting for Democrats. Like there's a difference between tactically at the local and state level, voting for a pro-choice Democrat to stop some Republican ghoul from taking over the state and turning it into fucking Handmaid's Tale or whatever, and like actually being every single election voting for Democrats. And when you press RDSA rightists, when you press rightists in general on this, like that's always either emotionalism or a misreading of one of the great communist theoreticians. So that is revisionism. Selectively cherry picking stuff and using it to justify something that is objectively against the interests of the proletarian revolutionary movement on an international scale. For example, why am I not voting for Kamala Harris? Well, for one, she's a fucking prosecutor. And for two, she like literally is one of the perpetrators of the genocide in Gaza. So revisionism will have you thinking that genocide is not a red line. Hundreds of thousands of people are dead with weapons that Biden and Harris sent to Israel. And they always lean on, oh, the NLRB. Like, okay, so you want American workers to wash their hands in blood and take the blood money from the Democrats. Like, that's social chauvinism. So anti-revisionism is basically rooting ourselves in principles, time-honored principles of the communist movement. No, we cannot seek a better life for ourselves at the expense of our Palestinian class siblings. No, change is not going to come from peaceful agitation and petitions. And we've both seen the movie Civil War. Like, no, I do not think that the left is ready to engage in armed conflict in the United States right now. Like, that's stupid. And everybody, when they want to try to critique Maoists, they say, oh, well, you guys want to start your peoples. I'm like, no, like, we're not idiots.
Yeah, in the movie, they mention, like, at the start, they're like, the Maoist faction, the Maoist militia was fighting this right-wing militia, but they don't actually like, talk about it. But I thought that was funny that all the radical left groups the movie mentioned, they mentioned Maoist is like the rogue one. And I think that it is like the stereotype in people's heads. Like, when people think Maoist, they think, like, ultra-leftist and throwing Molotov cocktails at a police station. Right?
What's
Like,
wrong with throwing Molotov cocktails to the police station?
hmm?
Well, what's wrong with throwing Molotovs at a police station?
Well, I mean, it's just like an easy way to get your whole organization like kind of destroyed.
That's why we want the masses to do it. Like, do you honestly expect somebody to jump up and be like, "This is for the fucking Communist Party of the United States, Marxist-Leninist Maoist, hurrah!" No.
Well, it's also the stereotype is that like feds work within these organizations and sometimes like
Feds work within all
prompt people to
organizations.
do activities like that, which would like not necessarily at a police station, but like at a small business or something, right? And doing like an activity that would make it very easy to get targeted. Like that, hey kid, want to blow up a fucking like want to blow up a station, and it's like a cop with like glasses, an undercover cop, and he has like a Maoist shirt on or something. It's basically like the stereotype. But yeah, aside from that, like the broader point being that I think, yeah, people do have this idea like Maoists are necessarily ultra leftists, and perhaps that is based in a kind of like experience, like a kind of reality. But I don't think it's what you're advocating.
Like, a lot of people don't even know what an ultra leftist is. Like, some within the right in DSA accuse everybody that's to the left of AOC as being ultra leftist. And we Maoists have our own definition of ultra leftism, like what you just described. The kid just wants to rant, just wants to burn and blow up shit. Like, that's ultra leftism. And what is ultra leftism? Ultra leftism is basically getting ahead of the masses, like getting ahead of what the masses are prepared to do, and leading them into ambushes, leading them into situations in which massive numbers of people can be arrested or even killed. Like, that's your ultra leftism. Ultra leftism is not having firm political principles and trying to spread these political principles among the masses and uniting the advanced among the masses. That's why you need to study theory, because if you don't study theory, if you don't actually study definitions of the words that you're mindlessly hurling around, then you're going to end up making a fool out of yourself, and it's not going to be a good time. Like, I've seen a lot of that in DSA. And just to be clear, like, even the writers within DSA, I mean, technically they're still my comrades. Like, we're in the same organization. Like, I don't consider these people visceral enemies that I have to wage positional warfare unto death against. But a lot of people I've noticed are afraid of line struggle. Like, they don't want to engage in open political debate. They want to engage in debate in private. Like, they call themselves socialists in public, yet in private, they want to talk to me about how much they admire Mao and Ho Chi Minh. Like, I don't want to hear that shit. What the fuck are you telling me for? Like, you need to tell that to the masses. You need to tell that to the people that you're organizing with. And if you admire Mao and Ho Chi Minh and Fred Hampton and all these people so much, then you need to learn their lessons and you need to organize like.
I actually agree with one part that you said and disagree with the other part, which is the private public. I think that's somewhat inevitable part of politics, right? Because if you are going to like present an agenda to the masses, the reality is the masses will not like communism by its definition is ahead of the masses. Like, I think in nature, it's going to be like ahead of what a lot of people are predisposed to, just because people have been so thoroughly brainwashed throughout their whole lives to hate communism. So it's going to take a lot of work. And I think what matters more than being like, oh, I admire so-and-so communist figure, I kind of think that's pretty unnecessary. Not even that useful in the United States, depending on the figure, I guess. Like, some figures is easier to like than others, right? Due to like some having their hands less dirty. But I think what matters more is what you put in practice, right? Like, the masked line to me is a very useful idea in Mao, and one that should be kind of common sense, that I think a lot of like successful revolutionaries essentially did. Like, Che Guevara did this, or even like, actually, I've learned a lot about the reformist. He's not a socialist, but president of Mexico. Part of his success was the fact that like he went to every municipality in Mexico. Like, he really has, he's very in touch with the Mexican people, and that's why he's been popular. And
You talking about AMLO?
AMLO, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did. My last episode was on AMLO, actually, in the upcoming new president of Mexico. It's pretty interesting stuff. But yeah, like, I guess the lessons of the mass line, right? Does one have to be a Maoist to apply that? Because I think like the way I come at things is I like to study these revolutionary figures and see what lessons do they have that are tangible that we can use. But I don't really think like to reach a lot of Americans or countries that don't really have a tradition, like a real communist tradition, especially not the United States. So like go use like say I'm like a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, or even Marxist, Leninist, or even a Marxist, dare I say, like right, Trotskyist, whatever. Like I think to a lot of Americans, it like does more harm than it does good because like there's that meme where it's like you present the ideas to regular people and they often support them, but then you like put the words on it, they're like, oh. And I think people are just like that. Like a lot of people are just kind of they think very instinctively. So there is a certain like cynical adaptation that I think does need to occur, right, with like public messaging and the difference between private messaging.
Well, yeah, but we also have to keep in mind that like all of this stuff is tech. Like strategically, our goal, I think you would agree, our goal is to win the masses over to the idea of communism, right? And the necessity of establishing a communist order. Otherwise, we'll all be dead. So part of that
is my hot take that I always like to give to the social democrats. Even if you aren't in support of the idea of communism, you could call me a communist sympathizer. But if I were to be frank, I think we still have a lot of work to do as to what communism actually is. Like, I think communism as it is, we have like a very unclear idea as to what that is. And that can really problematize the transition. But I think it's by its nature, it's so far, right? It's like a stage after socialism that I think like to have actually even socialism in the first place, you almost need communism as like a presence, as a radical force to even push us in that direction, right? Like you didn't have democracy, right? Like prior to like the liberal movements that one essentially allowed the transition from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy. You had like the more radical factions in England, like the levelers and the diggers. Levelers were like full democracy, and the diggers were like communists, basically. Diggers were like proto like utopian socialists of sorts. So like you always need the radical forces, I think, to push us in that direction, even if you are kind of like quite like not sure about the idea of communism. So that's sort of my like pitch to the sock dems, so to speak.
Oh, if, and yeah, you didn't have democracy in Europe. We did have elements of it in certain societies in Africa, though. But like, of course, in the part of Africa where my ancestors came from, like the Yoruba nation, like it was mostly urbanized and you had kings and shit. But like in some of the more rural, tribal based parts of Africa, like that's where a lot of Black nationalists drew their organizing principles from. Like they actually went to Africa and they learned how things were done in these villages. Anyways, going back to what you were saying about like public and private messaging, I think that, yeah, there is a very, very big stigma around communism in the United States. The fact that people, for whatever reason, think that it's all right to get on Twitter and talk about who's going to be thrown in the gulag and who's going to be shot after some hypothetical revolution. I really don't think that's the best public relations for us anyways, either. Because like, that's what they're taught in school. And I guess a lot of these people are just edgelords. They're like, you know what? I'm a rebel. I hate society. I hate what's going on now. So I'm going to embrace this caricature that I've been taught of communism. And yeah, I'm going to be a fucking regimer. So yeah, everybody to the fucking gulag, everybody to the wall, nobody but me and my friends. It's like, it's just, these people are not serious. So serious people like us, it's our duty to, yes, I'm not going to run around being like, long live Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, principally Maoism, because people are going to look at me like, what the fuck is wrong with me? But it is important to patiently break down the myths and stereotypes that people have of communism. Because if our goal is a socialist, communist, whatever you want to call it, revolution, like people are not going to pick up a gun and fight for shit that they don't know what it is. So we have to teach people what communism is. Like we have to take the elements within people's lives that are socialists, that are communists. For example, in the Black community, if your mom or your dad is at work, another family member keeps your kids, babysits your kids for free. Why? Because it's important that the family unit pulls together. Like that shit goes all the way back to slavery. Like if Black people did not have communal tendencies that were left over in us from our experiences over millennia of development in Africa, like we would not have survived slavery. And several Black revolutionary theoreticians have like highlighted this, especially the anarchist tradition. Like they've highlighted that African-American people, yeah, I mean, you're a hip hop head. So you've tracked the development of our music. Like it's went from a sort of revolutionary way for Black lumpen proletarian youth to talk about the conditions in which they lived to fucking trap lords and lumpen bourgeois bullshit. But when you get to the root of all of our music, when you get to the root of all of our cultural expressions going back to Africa, like you will find a very, very strong communal trend in it. And our indigenous comrades, they've mentioned the same thing within their communities. Like a lot of these nations have communal communist traditions that we can draw on. So it's already there. But again, we have to take this thread, and as Fred Hampton would say, stretch it as far as it'll go. And before you know it, you won't have people being afraid of communism anymore. But yeah, if you're just meeting somebody, it would be kind of weird and kind of funky and, like you say, pointless and useless to just be like, hi, I'm a communist. I'm here to organize your neighborhood. Because people can be like, oh, okay, that's cool. Go away. So, yeah, and that's the thing. Like a lot of these people who call themselves Maoists, they really don't have all that much experience in talking to regular ass people. Like if you study Mao and you study how he actually moved when he was building the Chinese Communist Party, like this dude was everywhere. Like he was literally in the villages. He was literally gambling with warlords. He was literally drinking with the loafer on the corner. He was hanging out with peasants and helping them put out their crops. Like this guy was everywhere. And he, all the time he was doing this, he was studying and he was doing research. I highly recommend, if you haven't read it, the report on Shunwu. He like talks about, he broke down the makeup of this village that he had worked in. And he could have only found all this stuff out by talking to people and by working alongside them for months. I think it was actually written after he had pissed off the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. They're like, go do peasant things somewhere. So he did. And he helped generate the Marxist-Leninist Maoist methods of social investigation and class analysis. So I'm glad they sent him to the countryside.
Yeah, that is something worth clarifying to the audience, because like when you say you're a Maoist, you're not saying that the socialist or communist revolution is like a Maoist revolution per se. Like it's going to realistically be a coalition of various different socialist left political groups and perhaps even social democrats, depending on the situation, really.
Depends.
Like,
my opinion on the social democrats is they'll probably end up like the SRs in Russia. Like some of them will be left, some of them will be right.
Yeah. But like, yeah, because it's such a huge country, and any new communist project is going to adapt to its conditions and adapt to the people of the various regional differences in that region, in that country. So it's not going to just be like one ideology. I think people have this like silly online idea that when you identify as an ideology, it means like this is the right faction, the rest are enemies, right? But you identify with Maoism because it's like closer to your belief system, what you think is useful, but not that like every like that you're going to get like a Maoist party that's going to like swoop to power or something. And I think I remember you even telling me, or I'm not sure if it was on your stream or on your tweets, I forget where it was, but you mentioned that realistically the United States is it's not gonna be able to dispense with things like freedom of speech. You're gonna have to have a form of democracy. It's the idea of you can just have like a USSR style dictatorship of the proletariat where you just crack down all your dissent. It's unrealistic. I mean, obviously there's gonna be cracking down on like enemies who try to overthrow the revolution. That's just politics. That's just realistic like war, right?
But I know you studied Machiavelli. What did Machiavelli say? Like when a people are accustomed to having rights and you try to take those rights away, what happens? Bad things. So no, I have no interest in being like, okay, here's the Constitution. You can't have this. No, That's dumb. Like, why would I want to take, if you want to go to the bar and be like, you know what, this guy, Black Red Guard, he's an asshole. I don't care. No. Like, I like my own freedom of speech. I do not want rights for myself that I would deny other people. And like guns, like people keep talking about, oh, gun control. We need to take guns away. Like, well, like, no, that's not going to happen. Like, if anything, guns are probably the only thing that make this shithole worth living in.
Did you know
Like,
Marx wanted to move to Texas?
you wanted to move to Texas?
No, Marx.
Really?
Karl
Yeah,
Marx.
there were a lot of German immigrants there. There's
Yeah.
like there's whole towns with German names down there. New Braunfels. Yeah, there are a lot of German immigrants down there. 48ers.
Yeah, because I mean, like the Prussian state was getting pretty harsh after 1848. So like that's why Marx went to England to like finish capital, and he had some degree of free speech there, but still like he saw America as even more advanced because you had like gun rights, whereas in England you had to I think own like an estate to own guns. So it's he saw that as like this is like the only these are some great means for the proletariat to actually mobilize themselves. And I know I feel like that's something people really take for granted in the United States. Like in the United States, there's a lot of people who think like nothing is possible because it's a settler colonial state and people are too reactionary. But I mean, like there's also a lot of things that give a lot of opportunities in the US, particularly the freedoms to mobilize, because it's I mean, any way the US cracks down on dissent, it's like through like legalistic means or outside the law through like the deep state and whatnot. But in a lot of countries, you can just like you can ban words. I mean, in Quebec, communism was banned for a very long time. In Canada, like it was straight up banned. They just banned communism.
That's why the fuckers don't deserve self-determination.
I mean, to be fair, this is Quebec prior to like Quiet Revolution. This is Catholic Quebec, but still.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of Quebecers. Well, they did have the FLQ, which was, I guess, pseudo-based. But there was also a group of people down here, like one of them was French-Canadian, Mark Lavasser, and they were going around robbing banks and shit. Yeah, I really don't have all that much sympathy for your Frenchies.
It's a weird thing because like Quebec is known, with the exception of Montreal, I'll add, but like Quebec is known to be like the most racist province. Like,
Yeah,
it's just kind of true. But
really.
it's also
Even
like the
even
most
even
socialist
even
province in terms of its like traditions after the Quiet Revolution, because its early independence leaders like René Lévesque were like socialists and not anti-immigrant. It was kind of after where like when the referendum to separate from Canada failed, like some of the like hardliners who like had taken over the party basically blamed it on immigrants, and you kind of I don't know, it's weird. Became less socialist and more racist over time.
you consider Quebec more racist than Nova Scotia, which is literally known as the Mississippi of the North.
Well, it's hard to say because like Nova Scotia is so small that like their presence isn't felt like at the national level, whereas like you see like because it's based on representation, right? Like, Quebec just makes up so much more seats in the Canadian Parliament that like I don't know, you hear like literally the Bloc Québécois is actually the third biggest party right now. The NDP, which is the Social Democrat Party of Canada, is not even the third biggest party anymore. They're the fourth biggest party in terms of seats, which is fucking wild.
They got bumped off by the Frenchies.
Yeah.
No, they should just fucking collapse, disband them. They cannot restore their honor after that slight.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me started. The NDP sucks, dude. Like, and it's annoying because the leader, Jagmeet Singh, I know has like socialist sympathies. Like he used to be like a kind of communist back in his youth, and now he's kind of like a washed Democrat who is like afraid of any class struggle rhetoric. And he won't say the NDP are socialist, but everyone thinks they are anyway. So why don't you just embrace it? Like, fuck.
Many such cases. That's what I keep trying to tell our rightists and DS. Like, you do not have to, like, I'm not a firm believer I'm not a believer at all in allowing the enemy to set the tone of your language and speech. Like, that they're going to attack you regardless of whatever you do. For example, the whole situation around AOC and Jamal Bowman, like they were so afraid of being associated with Hamas. Like AOC literally denounced Palestinian solidarity activists, my friends, and within our lifetime, and Students for Justice of Palestine, and various other revolutionary Palestinian solidarity organizations. I was like, why would you do that? Like, you were frittering away what remaining goodwill that you have left within the Palestinian American community, which was already near nil. For what? They're still going to attack you. They're still going to call you a communist. Like, if they're going to call Kamala Harris a communist, what the fuck do you think they're going to do to you? Like you said, embrace it. But it just shows a massive, I think, class gap in these organizations. Like, you have the proletariat that tends to be more radical. You have colonized people who tend to be more radical. But you also have a lot of professional middle class people that are overwhelmingly white. And like, that's how they move. Like, you go to meetings and you see how they move. Like, they're very keen on not allowing radical messages to get out because they'll scare the hoes, basically. And they don't want to do that. And by the hoes, I mean the Democrats and the other people, like the other small business owners and people who I really don't give a shit about, but they really do give a shit about. So
Sometimes that's true and sometimes that's not, right? Sometimes it's just an excuse for like the fact that they're afraid of really fighting the power, essentially. Because when you really do point the guns at like the fat cats, that's when the real threats come. That's when your life's in danger. And I think like a lot of people use not appearing too radical as an excuse just to essentially like preserve their political careers.
yeah,
But there is an extent to which, like, yeah, you can't scare the hose too much. Like, you can't just come like out the gate and be like, Stalin was
I
like,
don't even like
I know
Stalin.
you don't, I know, but like,
prob-
well, I think I think defending Stalin is like wrong on principle. It's better to like it's good to be critical of Stalin on principle, but like, I mean, in general, the word communist to me is also like, it's the kind of thing where like the far right will criticize of being communist, but I think it is worth, yes, on one hand debunking, but I mean, it's more so the iconography that I take issue with, actually, less than the words. Because when people use like the red flags, the hammer and sickle, they're using what is, well, kind of an outdated symbol in general, but I was kind of always outdated for the United States because the United States never had like a peasantry. I mean, like farmers are rich. Like farmers in
Well,
America are rich. Like there's
I'm going to push back a little bit on you there. I would say that the sharecroppers kind of approached the status of like pseudo serfs. Well, I guess a more accurate comparison would be Latin American peons. Like, my grandma, actually, two of my grandparents were sharecroppers in Mississippi. Like, I asked my grandma one time, like, Grandma, why did you drop out of school in the 9th grade? And she was like, I had to pick the Peckerwood's cotton. Otherwise, my family was going to get kicked off the plantation and we would have starved to death. There's also massive organizing of sharecroppers. There were black and white sharecroppers. There was a sharecropping Southern Tenant Farmers Union. That's what it was called. Yes, the acronym is literally STFU. Shut the fuck up. Like, conditions were horrible. Conditions for white sharecroppers were, in many cases, not that much better than black sharecroppers. But like, you were literally bound to the land. Your landlord could keep you in as much debt as he wanted to because he knew that you could not read or write and you couldn't do figures. You couldn't do basic arithmetic because they didn't teach you. They were not in the habit of teaching former slaves how to do math. So they would basically cheat you and they would maintain you as a sort of debt slave, which is pretty much all most peasants are, debt slaves. So you thought that you'd settled up, then time to sell the cotton. No, look, Mrs. So-and-so that stole all the money. Or, oh yeah, you remember when your kid was sick? He had dysentery and he had to go to the doctor. Yeah, that's another $50. Oh, little Ticey wore a hole in her shoes. That's another $20. So they were basically just nickel and dime you until you had to do another contract and be on that plantation for another year, basically working as a slave. So I would say that America has had something approaching a peasant, peon, serf class, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, like I think they often call them this is basically almost like indentured servitude, and that persists even past the revolution, which was supposed to abolish all that, but like didn't. And yeah, tempting me to get into the American Revolution. We're not going to do that. Maybe the back room. We'll see.
You're a bigger Marabou than you're the biggest Marabou I've ever seen.
What does that mean?
You live in Canada. It's basically America with funny accents. Why are you so obsessed with this country? It sucks down here.
Well, I'm, an American citizen also. So it's like,
So am I.
so that's like part of like why I find America fascinating. I mean, it's also just like so much of what happens in Canada is sort of like downstream of the US. And I think more people I encounter here like know more about the US system than here. Like a lot of average Canadians think we have like it's a presidential system. Like they don't quite get it. Like they don't understand that.
Wait, they think that Canada is a presidential system?
They don't think that, but like they kind of think that Trudeau is like the guy who's deciding everything when Trudeau is this kind of leader of the party, and the party is just he's just leader of the party that got the most seats in parliament. Whereas in America, the president really does have power separate from the Congress. Like, America is an uphill battle. Like, in my opinion, democratic socialism, like electoral road to socialism, in theory is possible in Canada. In theory, may I add, like, this is assuming it actually takes a revolutionary road after it would be elected. But like, I don't even think that's possible in the United States, because the United States, there's like 3 different battles you have to fight. You have like the Congress and Senate and the presidency all separate. Whereas in Canada, it's all in one election, really. So
you've also got the Supreme Court, which literally can be like, yeah, we understand you elected a commie president, but that violates this. So fuck you.
Yeah. It's pretty insane. Yeah. Well, Mexico is trying to cut down on that. They're trying to make them subjected to votes, which is interesting. That would be good if they did that too. Did that in America.
We neither need more people, like FDR actually tried to put more people on the Supreme Court. But we either need more people on the Supreme Court, or we need to be like it needs to be like it is in civilized countries. Like, these people need to have term limits. Like, there's no way in the world that I get appointed to the Supreme Court when I'm 45 years old and I serve until I'm 85, 90. No, like, shit's changed. And the older you get, the more conservative you get. So, like, yeah, I might have been a radical in my youth, but now I'm 85 years old, and here I am, fucking Clarence Thomas. If I turn into Clarence Thomas, I personally authorize you to shoot. Anyways,
I heard you say that exact same sentence about Van Jones. Also,
well, yeah, he did identify as a Maoist. I don't think Clarence Thomas ever did. I think Clarence Thomas has always been an asshole. I think he went to one Vietnam War protest, and he was like, "Oh, well." I think he actually got yelled at, and he's like, "Oh." So I guess he dedicated the rest of his life to becoming a conservative asshole that hurts his own people as a result of getting yelled at.
The Trotskyist to neocon pipeline. I've heard also of the Maoist to Democrat pipeline.
Well, I'm not a Democrat yet.
Yeah, I wonder why that is though. Like, I wonder why like that is that, like, I know maybe it's probably overstated, but like that different path, like why do some trots in the United States like gravitate to the Republicans as they get older, whereas Maoist Democrats? Could just be that like trots are more white. But
yeah,
I also think like there's something about the militarism in Trotskyism. Like I just think like a lot of people like Trotsky because he is like every nerd's fantasy. He's like the ultimate alpha nerd. Like, he has his glasses. He's a theoretician, but he becomes military commander. I mean, it's not hard to see how someone who might become disenchanted with communism might just be like, we need to build up our military and go to Iraq.
Trotsky and Stalin is basically the whole nerd jock squabble carried over into the communist political sphere.
Yeah, I mean, I see though Trotsky and Stalin as like more similar figures, and people sometimes like to separate them. I much prefer Trotsky, by the way, because I think Trotsky was more principled and just more intelligent, like, frankly. But yeah, I want to go back to another term I want to de-autismify a little bit, which is the revisionism.
De-autismify.
Because revisionism is just like the issue with it, right? Is like, clearly Marxism has been revised in different situations to say things that Marx himself disagreed with at the time that were necessary to change in those contexts. Like, for example, Mao placing emphasis on the peasantry. Like, Marx did not think the peasants were revolutionary. He called them like a sack of potatoes or something.
Of course, he
And
was dealing with European peasants.
yeah. So it's like in that China's context, that was a necessary change. Or in like the lumpen proletariat, Marx didn't. Yeah, he was said some mostly negative things about the lumpen proletariat. Whereas
Despite him
like,
being lumpen himself.
yeah, in certain sense, perhaps. And like Huey Newton, of course, kind of like theorizes like the revolutionary potentials of the lumpen proletariat. So it's like clearly Marxism's been revised, and you're obviously cool with that. You would think that's necessary, but what kind of like ex- what cases of revising Marxism, classical Marxism, makes the political movement revisionist? Because like to some extent, some revisionism is good. I mean, the way I'd understand it is like perhaps it's just like when you abandon class struggle. Like, is that like the kind of deal breaker? Because Marx didn't say much about like. I'm skeptical, by the way, of like general just guarantees of knowledge. Like, I feel like Marx is a sort of like figure that guarantees knowledge a little bit like how religion works. Like, people have like the Bible, the Quran, whatever. I don't know. I'm skeptical of that, but like obviously you're like pragmatic, and in practice, all communists who have succeeded were pragmatic. Like, they change stuff. So that's kind of why I'm like, to when does revisionism actually mean something? Like, how do we have a definition of revisionism where it does mean something? Like, I get it in the context of Rosa versus Bernstein, where like Bernstein is essentially like kind of for just like working within the parliament and just hoping it gets bigger and waiting for the perfect moment to happen. Whereas Rosa is more like an actionist. I can kind of understand like her criticism of him abandoning the class struggle. But I don't know. When does like revisionism mean something? Basically, is what I'm asking. Because like in today's context, it's not very clear to me. Right? It's really not that clear to me. Because to me, I care whether like the ideas are good and make sense, rather than like whether they're good for the people, rather than like revisionist.
That's because you're an ideas guy. But in practice, like the examples you mentioned, like why did Mao realize that Maoists realized that peasants are the revolutionary subject in China? Well, like you said, he was pragmatic. Okay, if we are to rely on the proletariat, which actually are like quite a few people within the Chinese Communist Party, like they had a classically Marxist Leninist view of this. Like they consider peasants to be sacks of potatoes, or I guess this is China, sacks of rice that are useless and conservative and prone to becoming bandits. So they wanted to work exclusively in the cities where the proletariat was. And what happened? You had 1927, 1928, you had the Shanghai Massacre. So Mao was like, see, this is what happens. Now do you see what I'm fucking saying? So lessons or revisions of Marxism, as you would say, are taught through blood. Like Mao knew that he could not rely on less than 10% of the population to make a revolution in a country with 800 million people. He had to go to the peasants because there was not going to be a revolution in China without the peasants. So you mentioned Huey Newton. Huey Newton came to sort of the same conclusion. He saw, like if you read his Intercommunalism, he saw the approaching decline of the traditional industrial proletariat. Like that's why do we have a huge swath of our country called the Rust Belt? Because of neoliberalism. He also predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I find hilarious. But he predicted the arrival of neoliberalism and the response by these auto company lords to increased union strength. Like you literally had a communist union, the Detroit Revolutionary Union movement in Detroit in the late 60s. They were squabbling with and they opposed the racist diktats of the United Auto Workers, and there were actually some concrete gains made. So in response to this, they were not going to allow communists to take over their factories. They sent them to Mexico. Huey predicted all of this. Huey predicted this struggle. And that's why he put more emphasis on the lumpen proletariat, because like that was the base. Those were the peasants within the context of the Black community in the United States. Well, the new African nation in the United States, whatever you want to call it. So when is it necessary to make revisions to what what our Marxist canon tells us is correct? When you are dealing with the situation, when you are dealing with the struggle, when you're dealing with a people that don't necessarily fit in the box developed by these Europeans working almost 2 centuries ago, it's kind of necessary to be like, hey, yeah, I get what you were saying, Marx, but that was the conditions of Birmingham, England in 1863. Like, we don't live like that no more. I'm sorry. So that's not revisionism. That is creative adaptation of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism to modern day conditions. Revisionism would be something like, oh, you know what? Americans are never going to make a revolution. Let's just dedicate ourselves exclusively to campaigning for the Democrats. Let's get jobs for ourselves. So when you wash out the key Marxist principle of class struggle, the necessity of militancy, and if we're expanding into Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, the continuance of class struggle after the establishment of socialism, like those are, I guess you would say, your big three. Like, if you reject class struggle, if you forget class struggle, and if you promote class peace, you promote the strategy, not the tactic of working with various segments of the progressive petty bourgeoisie and bourgeoisie, that's revisionism, because that is opening up the party or the individual cadre or the mass movement or the United Front or whatever part of the work you're doing, that opens it up to corruption by what Mao would call sugar-coated bullets. Because I mentioned a continuance of class struggle under socialism. You've studied the Cultural Revolution. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that building block of Maoist theory. Basically, we believe that when you establish socialism, you have to be vigilant because, as we've seen in China, there could be a reversal. Like, you think that you're secure, but the fact that the Communist Party holds the keys to a lot of shit, that could lead, just like in the Soviet Union, to the birth of a nomenclatura, a new bourgeoisie, so to speak. And if you allow that, then they can either peacefully or with violent means take back control of the country and establish a socialist, social imperialist system. Basically, red flag, but opposes the red flag. So failure to recognize that in the Maoist sense, I know you're not a Maoist, but failure to recognize that, I would say, is probably one of the main revisionist tendencies that's out today. Because, okay, fuck China for a minute. Like, we're not talking about China. Neither one of us is Chinese. We have no say in what happens over there. But people that believe stuff like that also tend to carry it over into our actual work in the American Revolutionary Movement. So now they're saying, oh, sure, we can allow landlords into the organization. We can allow cops into the organization. We can allow prison guards into the organization. And yeah, that shows basic lack of understanding of Marxist principles of class struggle. So that would be the consequences of revision.
Would those last three things you mentioned really be revisionist? I mean,
What?
like Engels, right, owned a factory, and like you have a lot of rich socialists. In
You have a lot of rich fellow travelers, but can you be rich and be a rich and be a socialist? I mean, sure. If you like,
to some extent,
example,
yeah. Like, he's not,
like,
not rich, but like he was like well off.
Like, say I'm Bobby Brown's son or something. He leaves me a shitload of, well, I think the fucker's broke. Say I'm, I don't know. Say I was one of
What I'm saying, like, when you do have class traders, like,
yeah.
I think that's kind of where, like, I think class struggle is necessary, and that's like the sense I would say I'm still Marxist. Like, in fact, there's a lot of Marxism I think is wrong, like in terms of predictions, in terms of even like economic theory. But in terms of what Marxism gets like correct is that it's really the only like political canon that is so that emphasizes the central reality of class struggle. And I think without that, that's the reason why the bourgeois revolutions really never fulfilled many of their goals, simply because it lacked this element of class struggle. And like that's necessary. But the thing about class struggle, right, is I think class struggle and political struggle aren't necessarily always the same thing. Like not all class struggle is political struggle. And with class struggle, what can sometimes happen is like a class identity politics, where like one's revolutionary potential is determined by their class. And I think that's kind of like, that's actually itself not even really Marxist. I mean, it comes out of like, you could argue when
Bloodline,
some say it comes out of,
bloodline theory.
some say it comes out of Stalinized Marxism, like Stalin, but actually you could say it comes from Lukács, History and Class Consciousness. Some say that too. Like, but it's like not really in
Never
Marx.
read Lukács.
I don't even know if he's really necessary. Like, I haven't read enough of him either. I've only read some of History and Class Consciousness, but like, I'm just going off of what like people sometimes say, like the root of class identity politics. I think it was President Mao's thinking a lot, which I think was like a weakness. You've seen my like second video, the one that's more.
They literally had bloodline theory among some of the Red Guards, and like Jiangqing and Mao had to be like, look, what the fuck is wrong with you people? Mao was like, my dad was literally a landlord. Are you going to beat me up too?
Yeah, he thought bloodline theory was stupid, but like the thing is I think part of that thinking was in Mao to a certain extent. Like he had the 4 black categories, or was it 5 black categories, which was kind of organized in that sort of identity. And look, I think politics is complicated. A lot of people get involved in politics not for economic self-interest. People get involved for all sort of reasons. Like some people get involved for like they want a meaning in life. Some people have really weird savior complexes. I think like that explains the rich socialist phenomenon as a sort of like,
And neither one of those people should like be allowed to have like hold like the majority of leadership positions. Like, for example, in the Black liberation struggle, should we turn over our leadership to white saviors? Like, no, class identity politics does so. Like, and I believe it exists. Like, people are like, yo, what did your dad do? What did your mom do? What did your grandma do? On the other hand, I can play class identity politics because, like, yeah, all my fucking grandparents were sharecroppers and cowboys. But, like, yeah, I get what you're saying. And while we should acknowledge that, yeah, you can't have communists that come from the upper middle class, hell, even a bourgeois background. But at the same time, we have to root ourselves in the proletariat, because the stereotype of socialists and communists is that we're a bunch of spoiled rich kids that
that is
against society.
that's kind of what I'm getting at, right? Is like,
Yeah.
it is a strange contradiction. It's not necessarily like a good thing. I think it would be better if the communist movement was more in touch with like the working majority, but it does seem to be like a reality that the people who have the time energy to study communist theory often are either people who are like full-time students in academics, or they're just like rich kids, right? Like you can work and study, but it requires an incredible amount of discipline that like most people just don't have, right? It's like, it requires discipline. And
even then, if you work and study, like my job, I sit down a lot. So you're not going to be able, like if you're a cashier or a clerk at a dollar store, or you work at McDonald's, that type of work, it's not going to allow you time to study. Like, I'm sitting by the fryer waiting for the fries to get done over here reading fucking Lukács. Like, no. So even like most of the jobs that allow you to do that, like Mao worked in a library. Lenin was an attorney. Like literally all of our great theoreticians had that type of background. Hell, even myself, even though my grandparents were sharecroppers and stuff like that, like poor as fuck, like I'm still relatively privileged compared to black kid that grew up in the projects in New York City or something. Like, yeah, I lived in the hood, but at the same time, I was bussed out to a majority white school. We had a nice library, stuff like in the United States to ameliorate segregation and its consequences. They would literally force black kids to get up at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it was a voluntary program, but they would literally have us get up at 5 and 6 o'clock in the morning to go out to this rich white school. And there I took AP classes, stuff like that. So that fixed it so that I could get into a decent college. So even within oppressed nationalities, like there's stratification. And it's important that even if we recognize that, yeah, we have privileges, all of that, whatever, we have to root ourselves like Mao did, like actually go down and talk to the people and be amongst the people and then actively recruit the people. Like, why aren't there many proletarians in socialist organizations in the United States and Canada? Because a lot of these people are either afraid of proletarians or they don't hang out with and deal with proletarians unless they want something from them. Like, oh, hey, come to this rally. Oh, hey, come to, I see your picket line. Could I sell my newspaper there? Like, it's a parasitic relationship to the proletariat. And people think that the proletariat is stupid, mindless shills waiting to have their brains filled. No, the proletariat is actually a very, very pragmatic class, and they are very, very good at smelling bullshit. That's why you don't have masses of proletarians joining things like the Spartacus League, because like they don't give a fuck. It doesn't impact their daily lives. It doesn't offer them anything. So,
well, it's not in
where-
their economic interest in the short term. Like, while in theory it is,
Yeah.
like they're like, well, like this probably isn't going to happen, so it's not worth my time. I'm better off just like focusing on like improving my own life. And that's kind of why I think though that like you do see like people of like middle sort or even wealthier who get into left politics because their motive isn't financial interests, because they're almost like exempt from financial interests. Because like, I mean, there's this idea of the
they're not exempt.
Well,
they're
wait,
not exempt. What rich leftists tend to do is
So,
they
like-
use their money as a sort of like means to exercise leverage. That's what they tend to do. Like, they're not entirely disinterested.
but what I more so mean is, yes, like the bourgeoisie has a compulsion to always increase its profit, like especially if they're invested in capital and they want higher returns. But often the case, sometimes people with money, like they now have like another need they want to actualize. Like they want some kind of meaning, they want some cause to be part of. And there's all sort of like funnels that they designed for rich people to kind of like get a sort of meaning in life. Like there's all this like new spirituality stuff, like there's televangelists, there's all sort of these causes people can commit themselves to. There's charities. That's what charities literally are for, like for bourgeoisie to feel better about themselves, essentially.
I was about to say, rich people generally don't give to televangelists. Televangelists make their living off the social security checks of blue-haired grandmothers and the proletariat.
You'd be surprised though. Like it does seem like statistically, like a lot of like it's Protestants on average, like evangelicals are wealthier than like Catholics, for example, in the United States, like much more.
Really?
Yeah. Like Catholics are poor. But like that's not to say all evangelicals are like there's plenty of true evangelicals in the South and in
I think the Catholicism, I think the like increase in poor Catholics probably has to do with the influx of Latino people.
yeah, well,
like-
it is racial. It's like Irish and Latinos, basically.
No, Irish and Italian Catholics, all the ones that I've met have money.
Yeah, maybe now. Maybe not when they arrived. Like when they arrived, it was different. But like, yeah. Anyway, the point being though is like, I like what really opened my eye on this was reading Benjamin Studebaker's book, and I had him on my show recently, called "The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy," and he was like pointing out how it is a feature of political movements everywhere, even on the most radical left. There are like powerful, wealthy people that are behind even like the most revolutionary movements, even if they're not like the pivotal role, they will like gain help in some regard. Like, I mean, even Lenin took money from rich Germans, right? Like, it's not like
Rich Germans had an interest in the defeat of the Russian Empire. Sure.
Yeah, sure. So that's what I mean. Sometimes there's conflicts of interest or like all kind of motives that might get people with resources to support a movement, like whether it be maybe like some rich person's family made their money off of like an institution rooted in slavery or something like that they're guilty about, and they kind of have this like white guilt this thing, and they want to wash that off, and instead of doing the charity or the classic like thing,
That's how
they like, back
the
and go
Black
back to
Panthers
power.
Panthers literally had a whole section of their party that was dedicated just to taking money from like white guilty Hollywood celebrities.
And that's good. That's based. But like I
Yeah.
agree with those people should not be in charge. Like
Yeah.
those rich
I
folks.
guess it's better. I guess it's better than getting shot trying to rob a bank or something.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, well, like it's like where are you gonna get like the finances from? And that's the thing about America. It's such like a huge country. Like just thinking about organizing there, it's just very difficult because there's just so many places to be. And that's kind of why I guess to circle it to the DSA, where I do see like the DSA as like kind of like realistically the organizing within one's local DSA chapter is probably the best thing like a radical leftist can do at this point because it's decentralized. I mean, it's like it's a local chapter based on that region, whereas trying to start a party and move it beyond a locality is just requires so much resources that you're going to have to
It's
get like
not even.
funding somewhere.
It's not even worth trying to start a party if you don't have any mass base. It's just going to be a bunch of assholes centered around a piece of paper calling itself a program, but really is toilet paper. And like all parties that have been successful have had a mass base. Like the Filipinos, they have a mass base. They're rooted deeply in the peasants and in the proletariat of the Philippines. The Indian Maoists,
But even
they're
then,
rooted.
and they've been around for how long? Like they've been around for so long. It takes so long to like cultivate a base. And even then, I would like I
It's
kind of
called Protracted People's War for a reason, buddy.
correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of think like the base of the Filipino Maoists is a bit overstated. Like in terms of how popular they actually are. Like it really does seem to be like more like like a rural, very particular rural phenomenon.
I mean, I don't like talking down about like other revolutionary movements. Like
That's not what I'm trying to do
actually,
either. But like I know there's some people who are like, the Maoists in the Philippines, like they talk as if they're gonna have a revolution, like the People's War is gonna like win
it
anytime.
is going to win. It's just not going to be like they're still on the stage of what we call strategic defensive. Like there's 3 stages to a Maoist people's war. You've got strategic defensive when you're basically like you're on a defensive. That's what it means. You got the strategic stalemate when your forces are basically at the same level as the bourgeois government, right? So you could actually begin to segue into your strategic offensive, which is when you take power in the whole country. The Filipinos and the Indians are still in the strategic defensive stage, segueing into the strategic stalemate. So, I mean, they have a base. If they didn't have a base, they would constantly be getting turned in. Like if you could show up at a village and ask people to feed you or ask people to hide one of your fighters that has been injured, and the people like don't immediately turn that person over to the Filipino government for a reward. Like they literally put bounties on NPA members over there. And these are very, very poor peasants. So if they actually hide you and they don't turn you over for the reward, the bounty money, they kind of fuck with you. That's a sign that you have a mass base. So I wouldn't say that their base is overstated. I think what happens is a lot of people in the United States and in Europe who don't know what they're talking about, they want so desperately, like they live vicariously through other people's revolutionary struggles.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're like, oh yeah, the Filipinos are going to win next year. And these aren't malintended people. They're not bad people. They're just fucking stupid people. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't have any connections to any Filipino revolutionary organizations. They don't even have any connections to any new democratic organizations. They're just talking shit on the internet and engaging in online fantasy football, which, yes, I do agree is very stupid.
Well, that's kind of look. I think this tendency we're critiquing could be described as like third worldism to an extent, or like a LARPy third worldism. And I think the more, I guess, spicy take I would have, which you might disagree with, is that I think Maoism and Marxism, Leninism can very easily lead to third worldism. And the reason why is because these are ideologies synthesized in particular regions. And like, it's easy to forget that they're not really universalist. I don't really believe in a universalist a universal political ideology. It's always going to be kind of, you can believe in a universal political idea, like communism. Communism is an idea. Democracy is an idea. Liberty is an idea, right? Like, but like how that's going to occur is going to be specific. And like Marxism, Leninism wasn't what the Russian Revolution was. I mean, the Marxism, Leninism is like an ideology to legitimize the Soviet Union. It's like a regime ideology, and Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought is like trying to take Leninism and add new things to it, and that was necessary for their context. And I think like for communism to emerge in the West, there's going to be like kind of Western communism, and I think like there's has to be something like that, like a Western communism that emerges and that isn't like one of those stupid ideologies that you see now, like fucking MAGA communism or LaRoucheism or whatever. But like
Let's
there is going
let's
to be like communism to the Western context. Like, yes, I think like I think I'm very pro this idea of like socialist liberty. Like Americans like the language of liberty, and I think like liberty should be extended to the economic. And like if you talk in those language, that language is important because America is an individualist country. Like it just is.
yes.
It's such an individualistic country. There's
And
nothing.
people think that that individualism. I mean, I talked about the communalism that's inherent in Black American and in indigenous communities. But after desegregation and with I mean, I guess you could say, call it second half-ass reconstruction of the civil rights movement, like when we actually were able to start making money and like engaging more fully in American culture and the American economic life, and we were able to leave these shitty ass plantations in shitty ass parts of the South, like a lot of Black people, like we found our fucking niche and we loved it. So I would say that the individualism isn't just a white thing anymore. Like shit, you listen to hip hop, you listen to rap. Like I really don't see all that many unless you listen to explicitly conscious hip hop. Like it's all about, no, I'm gonna fucking get mine. I'm gonna get my fucking bag. Fuck everybody else. Fuck them. They're lazy. And it's like you basically have individualist American values seeping into what was originally a statement of rebellion from Black and Latino lumpen proletarian youth in New York City. So that just shows how America rots every fucking thing it touches as soon as it gets old to it and as soon as money starts passing around. But yeah, I agree. Like America, especially, it's probably, I'm not an American exceptionalist, but shit that works in the Philippines and India and in China and Russia simply will not work here. How do I know this? Because communists have been trying this for almost 150 years and it ain't no revolution yet. Why? Because Americans ain't responded to it. Americans don't want it. So I do agree. Like, and that goes back into the discussion of the thought and the ism. Like there has to be a specific understanding of how to make a socialist revolution, how to build a socialist project in the United States, because we can't do what everybody else has done because we ain't like everybody else.
Yeah. I mean, are you familiar with the historian Lewis Hartz?
No.
He posed the famous question, why no socialism in America? In the two books, but mainly the famous one's called The Liberal Tradition in America. And basically the thesis is essentially that because the bourgeois revolution in America was so complete for its time, it was way more complete than a lot of what happened in Europe, which was more gradual and overcoming feudalism, that America found itself kind of like jumping steadfast into this unfree freedom, like before everyone else, which is bourgeois freedom. It's like an unfree freedom. It's a contradiction. But like because they moved past feudalism, you had a more totalizing bourgeois culture and a individualist culture. Whereas a lot of like the collectivist traditions that are from Europe, we might think like Europe's more socialistic, but a big reason why in Europe and in Latin America too, why socialism has always been a little bit more easier to swallow is because of the collectivism that stems from the feudal culture of these countries. Because like feudalism, you need to remember, like the politics of monarchy was always framed in this collectivistic way. It was the parliament that was positioned to be like representatives of the bourgeois, the aristocrats. The king, the queen was always positioned as this like authority of the people, and that people are communities. They're not individuals, or they belong to this this collective. And so like this collectivist thinking, even though in the feudal context it's like reactionary, not progressive, this collectivist thinking makes people more predisposed to like socialism presented in this collectivist way, and that's the way it's traditionally been presented. Like very rarely has communism been presented in a highly individualistic way. I would argue Marxism is kind of to some extent an attempt at that, but it's still communistic. It's collectivist in nature, right? Like you nothing around that. So it's part of that is like, yes, the historical context, but also Protestantism. Like I think this is the big thing like communists forget. Religion. Religious heritage is so huge, and like whether you're going to be able to like make your politics kind of stick with people, because Protestant countries are way more like individualistic, because Protestantism, they're all about like my freedom. I'm against the papacy. I am like for this individual work ethic. And for that context, that's very progressive. It's very like, it's why it was like a good thing, I guess, in the context. But like, it's also paradoxical because this individualism makes people kind of see collectivism as an attempt to control them again. They see like every American thinks communism is an attempt to make the government control your whole life. And it's easy to debunk that by pointing to like what Marx and Lenin and Mao actually say. But a lot of people don't trust. And I think that's part of that is due to the experience of communism. Like with particularly the Soviet Union, I would say China wasn't really like this. Like China under Mao, you've seen my videos. Like I think China under Mao is like at least cultural
the best
revolution
fucking country in the world.
I wouldn't say that, but I would say it's like it was libertarian socialism. I think Mao was a libertarian socialist.
Yeah,
if that's a real, insofar as that's a real thing, I mean, he was pretty close to it. Like,
have you read the stuff from the Shanghai Commune?
Like what stuff particularly? Like you mean the workers' organizations? Because there was like huge splits and stuff. The Scarlet Red Guards and all that.
The leftists, Sheng Wulin, they basically the leftists of the whole like Shanghai Commune experiment. I think you would love them.
No.
Oh, but yeah, you should definitely. They're basically like I guess they would be called ultras today, but they were basically like, you know what, like, where is China going? Like, they were basically like, fuck all these bureaucrats, fuck all this stuff. Like, strictly, like, they basically set up a commune in Shanghai. And the upper echelons, the Chinese Communist Party, didn't like that very much because, like, you can't just take over one of the major. Like, it's funny because, like, the Cultural Revolution, like, it would overflow the dam, and then Mao would like scatter trying to get this. Like, no, you can't just grab weapons from the PLA and start shooting it out with the army. What is wrong with you? But this happened a lot. Like, that's why he ended up sending a bunch of people down to the countryside, because like you had massive battles in the streets of Chinese cities for no good reason. Like, so that was in Shanghai, and that was actually where I think 2 or 3 members of the Gang of Four came from. They came out of that experience. But yeah, he was a shit. So, but I think you'll like Sheng Wulin's stuff.
Yeah, Mao like supported the Shanghai Commune, but then turned against it, basically.
Yeah, because it started. Mao did that a lot. He did that a lot, just like the Gang of Four. Like all throughout the Cultural Revolution, he had the Gang of Four, thinking that he had their backs. That's why, like, some people refer to it as the Gang of Five. But then, like, right before he died, here he is supporting the rightist Hua Guofeng, telling him that, oh, with you in charge, I feel safe and secure. And he basically threw the Gang of Four to the wolves. Like, honestly, I don't think he gave a shit what happened after he died. I think Mao was just a pseudo-nihilist like that.
I mean, it's also understated how much Mao's mental condition might have played in his later years. Because, I mean, I just looking through so much footage when I was making that video, Mao during the Cultural Revolution was old. Like
He was old. He was old and he had Lou Gehrig's disease.
he has none of his teeth were there. He looked like he was high out of his mind.
He
Like
was.
it's hard. Like there is cognitive decline. Like when people hit past like 65. I mean you wouldn't be immune to that.
Yeah.
So like
Let's go, chairman.
I mean this is the thing. I'm curious what your thought on democracy is, because this is I think like I know it sounds like this sounds like such an uncool lib take. But I do think like communists ignore the democracy question a lot, because you mentioned that while like certain people of bourgeois backgrounds, whatever, they can like support the cause, but they shouldn't be leaders. And people who might have power fantasies or savior complexes, they sometimes get involved in communist causes, but they shouldn't be the ones with all that power. And frankly, I just think that most people who participate in politics, especially politics where it's not really advantageous to be part of, especially leftist politics, are often driven to some extent by power or something like vanity, power, or like meaning, simple meaning. And this is like my Machiavellian take. And I think like the only solution to that is essentially no one should have too much power, like some sort of democracy within like the party, but also for solving conflicts between parties. Because I think conflicts will inevitably occur, right? And this is something I think that needs more discussion. Like I don't have the solutions. I like flirt with different ideas, like sortition is something I've been talking about recently. Like this idea of like you have representatives who are randomly selected among the masses. I know what you think about like that question. Democracy.
Yeah. I mean, democracy is a
American
necessity.
communists. You can't.
I'm an American. Like, look, I'm an American communist, and most importantly, I'm a Black American communist. Like, my people have been denied the fruits of democracy for hundreds of years. So, as somebody that's like whose people have been at the bottom, whose people like have literally been slaves in this country, then serfs, and now honestly, I really don't know what we are. I think that democracy is important. Like, if you read the work of the Black anarchist Lorenzo Cambua Irvin, like he will literally tell you that we're not making a revolution just so that we can go back on the plantation, except this time it's called a work camp or a labor camp or a collective farm with a red flag flying over it. And we got white intellectuals telling us what to do. That's not going to work. So I would even go so far as to say that like Black radicals in the United States have a pretty substantial anarchic trend running through us, because we don't want to be under fucking white people under a red flag. Like, that's not going to work. Like the settler colonial contradiction in this country and the contradiction between the formerly enslaved and the former enslavers, these are the two primary contradictions in this country today. So democracy is a necessity, and most importantly, like it has to be an actual genuine democracy. Like if the masses of people say, party, do not do this, then the party should not do it. The party should not just like slide it through anyways and be like, oh, we know what's best for you. Because no, that's not how you practice the mass line. And then furthermore, you brought this up earlier, but any revolution and subsequently any socialist project will probably not have just one party in the United States, because no, that's too much like wrong. Like Americans simply will not accept that, even though we have the Democrats and the Republicans, which are basically the same party. Like if it's obvious like that, if we start banning other formations, especially in colonized communities, like we're not going to be able to go into an indigenous held area of the country and be like, hey, you can only have these indigenous people in this party represent you, because we'll be shot at. Same thing. We're not going to be able to go to whatever autonomous region that Black people have set up and be like, look, you can only have this party represent you in the Congress of Nationalities or whatever we end up having, because they'll be like, are you fucking crazy? Are we back under slavery now? So being pragmatic, we'll be forced to have like genuine democracy because Americans will demand it. Like you're an American citizen. I'm an American citizen. Like, we were literally taught that shit. Like, we already don't like being told what to do or being like thinking that we're being told what to do. So why the fuck would you set up a system that, like, first of all, these systems have all either reverted back to capitalism or collapsed in the case of the Soviet Union? Why would we want to model ourselves after shit that's failed? So, yeah, I definitely agree that in this American style of Marxist, Leninist, Maoist, whatever you want to call it, that democracy will have to be a key factor. Otherwise, we're wasting our time and we'll probably end up being overthrown.
I totally agree with you, but I think this leads to a revisionist conclusion.
Oh, really?
Yes, because all what you just said does problematize the dictatorship of the proletariat.
No.
And like this is, in my opinion, like the worst idea in Marxism. And I say worst, not like it's like bad in intent. It's just that it's the most poorly theorized idea in Marxism, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think there's a reason Mao himself was like dedicating these study groups to it, like in the mid 70s before he died. Because like I think he saw what happened with the Cultural Revolution as a sort of problematization of all of that. Because like the irony of the Cultural Revolution, right? It's like the rightists were the people of the proletarian backgrounds.
Yeah, Deng
How do you explain
Xiaoping,
that,
Deng,
right? Like,
Deng. Well, if you ain't never had shit, then when you have an opportunity to get shit, then you're gonna get that shit.
well, it does make sense, but that says a lot though about the idea. Like, if you assume like you have dictatorship of the proletariat, that you're going to get socialism. I mean, that's a false premise because they might just be interested in doing capitalism or like something else, or just preserving their power in the bureaucracy, which was a problem in the Soviet Union. So, like the dictatorship of the proletariat, I think, is one based on a false premise because there's this idea that like even if it is democratic, you have a dictatorship of the proletariat because right now we have a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. I mean, and that's actually kind of not accurate either because it's like, yeah, we have a bourgeois state, but like precisely what the bourgeois revolutionaries did in some countries more effectively than others, I would say in the American system is like the most effectively designed bourgeois state for many reasons. That's a good and bad thing. It's a really bad thing because it's also the hardest system for the proletariat to win democratically within, right? But the what I mean by that is like the bourgeois revolutionaries, you know, they understood to divide power within themselves. Like they didn't just want to check the proletariat. Like, yes, that is what they wanted to do. That's what Madison meant by like tyranny of the majority. It's really checking the mass. They're very explicit about that. They wanted to control the masses and particularly the property lists, but they also want to check themselves. They understood to like separate power within themselves. They knew that like if you have one faction of the bourgeoisie dominates the rest, you're gonna like really deprive people of their opportunities to get capital. And I think that's just as true of like the working majority. What's preventing a dictatorship over the proletariat? And to me, like that's kind of why I'm against the idea of dictatorship, to be honest. Like I think you can have like a proletarian democracy, or like I don't even know if it's proletarian, but like you could say mass democracy, whatever, socialist democracy. But dictatorship, like I just think that's antithetical. Like any dictatorship, even if it's like a one party state that's democratic from within, I mean, is, as long as the party state is like the dominant hegemon in society, there's nothing preventing them from being like, no, we're just gonna like do capitalism or we're gonna do what we want. So like mass line is good and all, right? But like it shouldn't depend on the goodwill of the party bureaucrats. Like the
You
party
also are
bureaucrats.
forgetting. You're also forgetting. You gave a very nice paean to the American bourgeois system. But you also forget another element that's in our Constitution: Second Amendment, guns. Gonzalo actually spoke of an armed
Yeah,
sea
that
of
too.
masses. Yeah, Gonzalo actually spoke of an armed sea of masses that would like, okay, if the party is fucking up, like the masses discipline the party. The masses know what's in their best interest, and the masses have studied the basic work of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. So if the party if you say, like, as you said, becomes a dictatorship over the proletariat. And I will even grant you that in many cases, like Laos, Vietnam, China, the later Soviet Union, that's essentially what all of these things are: dictatorships over the proletariat. Like, I would probably say that the freest country that still calls itself socialist today would be Cuba, because Cuba actually still consults the masses. They hold mass assemblies. Like, that's how they got the new gender law. So I would probably say that Cuba is probably the most democratic
I'd
of the.
actually, my spicy take is that Cuba was able to pass its gender law because its lack of democracy, not because of its excess of it. But then again, I'm not a critic. Like, I don't like to critique Cuba for lacking democracy because, like, I think they have more democracy than the Americans do. Because, like, in the sense that it's still like a one-party system, and yes, they have party democracy, is what you're saying. Like, they have inter-party democracy, and the proles can be part of it. But like, it's still like it's really the assembly that anyone can be part of. It's still the Politburo who like passes the agenda. It's kind of like a plebiscite. Like, they're like, here is the policy, yes or no, and like
Look,
they do
It's
it. I know.
it's still it's
Hmm?
still more democratic than here,
Oh, I would
because
agree.
like
I'm not a defender of like our systems, but my only point there is like, at the end of the day, like, there still has to be a system for where like there's no monopoly on absolute power, which there still is. The Cuba Party has a monopoly, and like they are also pretty capitalistic too. Like, let's not
that is
understate.
also true.
You can own
Yeah,
like you can actually like I've heard that there's a lot of like foreign Airbnb
there
landlords.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is. Like, I mean, you also have to consider the context in which this is happening. Like, they lost their big buddy, the USSR. So they had a special period where actually some of the stuff that they developed to avoid famine during the special period, like, it's actually like ingenious. They actually had quite a bit of success with hydroponic farming and urban farming. But like, they got to do what they got to do, man. Like, they're under embargo, they're under sanctions. They don't want the people starving. So, I mean, and this is what I always tell Maoists when they criticize Cuba. Like, if you were a little bitty island, 90 miles off the coast of one of the most insidious capitalist imperialist regimes, what would you do? Most of them have no answers. Like, it's easy to criticize from our privileged perch here in the United States. But if you ain't actually been into shit, that's why, like, I try to eschew criticizing other country systems that I have no control over, because chances are my country is the reason why that other country was shitty in the first place. So it just doesn't it just doesn't mesh well. Plus, as a black person, I've been taught to mind my own business anyway.
Well, you already know my take on like that kind of reform stuff. Like, I sympathize with the Bukharinites, which like
Ew.
Bukharinism is like Bukharin was sort of like Deng and Lenin put together. But he was
No, he was
he
like Dang on steroids.
no, the opposite. I would say Deng was Bukharin on steroids, because like Bukharin was
What did I
basically
say?
just for having like peasants sell their product on the market, basically, like, and having like a mixed economy. Whereas Deng like brought a stock market and like essentially sold out the working class of China to like foreign capital. I mean, it's like a whole
Yeah.
nother level of capital.
Using Bukharin's ideas as justification. Like, what
Yeah,
the
well, they also use Marx's ideas as justification, right? Like, they said like you need capitalism before socialism. And I mean, there's some element of truth in that. Some element of truth in that. Like, it is hard to have a wealth for all when you don't have that much wealth. Because it's like industrialization sucks no matter if it's socialist or capitalist. Like, the attempts to industrialize without capitalism in the USSR was essentially state coercion, right? And the attempt to industrialize in a egalitarian status way, which was like the Great Leap Forward, didn't really work all that well, right? Like,
Yeah, there are problems. The problems aren't as overblown as American economic theorists would make. But yeah, there are problems. You cannot make fucking steel in your backyard. And like Walter Rodney also talks about, if you read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, like, that's a whole other can of worms. Like, the Europeans, they did not want. Like, this is why it's always hilarious to me when white racists talk about, oh, we civilized you guys. If it wasn't for us, you'd still be living in mud huts. Well, for one, there's mud huts in Ireland and Greece. And I mean, building with earth is one of the oldest and most popular methods of building. Anyways, architectural tangent aside, Rodney literally talked about how Africa was to be a source of cheap labor, raw materials, and a dumping ground for excess goods. They did not intend for Africa to be an industrial superpower. Why were they like? Why do we think that the Italians and the Russians and all of these other nations that had business with Ethiopia, they didn't give technology to the Ethiopians? They were not going to. They already had one Japan. They weren't going to have a black Japan. So industrialization is, of course, a necessity. But I do think that, like, you don't have to have capitalism. Like, that's saying that many of these societies which have never really embraced capitalist logic fully in Africa can't see socialism. Like, I think that's sort of a Western centric view. And like, who are we to say like what other countries or other nations' development process will look like? Like, people would have said 150, 200 years ago that it's impossible for there to be socialism in a country that was a colony. And yet pretty much all of the countries that ended up with socialism were former colonies: Vietnam, Laos. I was about to say Cambodia, but I'm not opening up that can of worms. China, like, all of these countries were parceled up and doled out amongst each other by imperialists. Yet in the countries that are actually capitalists, that were capitalists, France, the UK, Germany, Scandinavia, the United States, Canada, no socialism whatsoever to be found. So
Yeah, but all those countries I mentioned became capitalist anyway.
that's also true. That they had maybe 20 or 12, 25 or 30 years of glory.
Well, and you could say, I mean, to some extent, some of it was necessary. I mean, like, I find Vietnam to be an interesting case too, because Vietnam was not growing very much. Like, and yes, the Vietnam War absolutely devastated Vietnam and made it very hard to build much of anything. But like, you did see like what's happened to Vietnam, honestly, is pretty incredible. Like, Vietnam is transformed, but like, they have many problems. They have corruption, inequality, and like all sort of issues, but they have experienced a sort of like China-like miracle. And that's not to be understated.
Miracle for who?
Well, I would say the whole population, but like some people way more than others, obviously. I mean, that's capitalism. Like, if you want to say capitalism, or you could just say like commercial society, I think capitalism is a kind of unfree freedom, right? Like, I mean, it's based on free labor. And that's why Adam Smith was like, when you read Wealth of Nations, it seems like, wow, this is so great. Because
free labor.
In contrast,
free labor, that's what my ancestors did. Free labor.
Well, no, but that's not free labor. That's the whole thing. It's like the idea of the bourgeois revolution was to overcome all forms of servitude. And free labor is the idea, like, you sell your labor on the market like a classic proletarian. And Marx's whole point is to say, like, this is actually a kind of unfree freedom, right? Like, it's not like that. That's where Marx's unique contribution to political economy is to like show the dialectical character of this like new system, right?
Yeah.
But
by your analysis, the American Revolution wasn't a real bourgeois revolution. The Civil War was our bourgeois revolution.
The Civil War was the completion of the bourgeois revolution. That's what I would say.
I mean, I wouldn't consider the American Revolution like a real revolution in the first place. It was just a squabble between rival sets of crackers. Like, if there's no improvement,
like that, though. Like, I mean, that's what the Indian War was. That's what the Dutch Revolt was. But there's still like, and also like the Third Estate in France. If there's no improvement in the lives of a large portion of your population, like, you can't say that there's been a revolution. Like, most Black people in the American Revolution fought with the British because they promised us liberty, like, from slavery. So all of the bullshit that the colonizers were talking about, oh, hey, liberty, land, yay, that was for white people. That wasn't for us. Like, we didn't get shit. We were slaves in 1776.
We were slaves in 1781 unless we escaped with the Brits to Nova Scotia. So
that's all fair. That is the contradiction that is the American Revolution. But let's not forget that the American Revolution, I think it's better looked at like a revolution that just happened to occur in the country rather than the country's revolution, because the American Revolution was sort of like a buildup that was long in the making of like essentially like the Enlightenment, the growing bourgeois revolution that you could say of the second wave of bourgeois revolutions. Because the first wave is like in England and Holland, the second wave is in America and France. And it's the second wave of bourgeois revolutions that makes slavery an institution that people now have to defend. Because like, yes, they were hypocrites. And like, although like a bunch of northern states did abolish slavery, the federal constitution didn't prohibit slavery, and slavery ended up expanding, of course, like as we know.
Yeah.
But, you know, after the American Revolution, this is when for the first time, like advocates of slavery had to now defend the institution. Like before they didn't have to do that. Like before it was like, this is an institution as old as time. Like there's it wasn't considered like something you had to defend. Whereas like the gradual, you could say, bourgeois revolution, which manifested and it really exploded in the American Revolution and inspired the French, which would go on to take this to a whole nother level. Like now all the slavers have to like come up with all these excuses. They have to come up with scientific racism to now justify, like they have to start measuring people's skulls to try to justify slavery and all.
They were doing that. They were doing that before the bourgeois revolution, though.
Well, like it was complicated because they justify first, like, but first it would just be like, we took you, right? We got you captive and like, you're a product of war, right? Then they start justifying it by religion. It's like, you're not Christian. But then they start converting to Christianity, then you need another excuse. So it's like curse of Ham, blackness, race, etc. But like Jefferson said all men are created equal. And what's interesting is John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis said that was like the biggest mistake Jefferson ever said.
And like Jefferson was a fucking hypocrite.
You could say, but I think like Jefferson's private writings did indicate that he thought like this would abolish itself over time. Like you could say he's a Southerner, right? Like he didn't want to like alienate those Southern and
he didn't want to free his own slaves neither. Never mind the one that he was raping.
Right, yeah. But like you can find it all within the founder. That's what's funny thing about Jefferson, right? Is like Jefferson is the most democratic of the founder, but he's like the worst on the slave question and the race question just in general, because like he's actually the only founder, as far as I'm aware of, to actually straight up like indicate like biological racial differences, even if he thought they were historical. He actually like does sow a bad seed there. Like his views are all over the place. But like in the case of Hamilton and the various founders, like they actually kind of thought like this would just like that blacks would just kind of become part of bourgeois society.
That shows how stupid they were.
Sure, but I'm just saying like that's like the bourgeois revolutionaries, you can call them idealists. Like that's the thing about liberalism. It's like was necessary, but it's also impossible because it's idealist. You know, like, but it was like what sowed the seeds for like abolitionism, right? At the end of the day.
I don't know. I think that black people chopping off their masters' heads sowed the seeds for abolitionism, but I'll digress.
I don't know, like the Haitian Revolution invoked like the spirit of the American Revolution. But at the beginning, the Americans actually supported the Haitian Revolution, but then they turned on it when like they turned on Jean-Jacques Dessalines, but they liked Toussaint. But it's still like shows that there was a certain degree, like they were like, okay, Haiti.
They didn't want it to spread to their colonies. They didn't want it to spread to their slaveholding states. That's why they literally took steps to keep Haitians out of the South, because they thought that they were going to teach us down there how to do what they did in Haiti. Like there was a literal trend called Haitianism. Like they were literally afraid, especially around New Orleans. Like New Orleans area had already had a slave revolt, and they had one in 1811. So this was after the Haitian Revolution. But like there was a trend like of slaves finding out about this and decided they wanted to try for one too. You had Nat Turner, you had, the Stono Revolt was actually in 1739, so before Haiti. But like there were several slave revolts in the United States, and what slave owners were afraid of was like this shit becoming coordinated, like Haiti, and now you've got another Haiti on the North American continent proper. So like it's well and good to like engage in these ideological discussions about the founders and about like what they thought. I don't know. I consider all of them crackers. Well, Tom Paine was pretty good, but like I don't give a fuck what any of these crackers thought. They own people that look like I don't give a fuck what any of their ideas. If they weren't hypocrites, they would have immediately freed all of their slaves after the revolution. They didn't do that. So honestly, I don't give a fuck.
Jefferson didn't. Washington did. And Hamilton, I believe, didn't even own slaves. But
I think he didn't. I think Ben Franklin owned like one, and he freed them. Like, what the fuck am I going to do with you? Here, go away, bye.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think they're connected. Like, it's the ideas and the revolts are connected because you do need like an ideology to justify like a post-slave society, right? You need to kind of. This is where like liberalism is very transformative because remember, like, let's remember that democracy is far older than like liberalism. Liberalism and democracy are separate, but it was liberalism that kind of sowed the seeds for like the abolition of slavery, not democracy, because the ancient Greeks really like had democracy, but they had like it all ran on slavery, right? And virtually every empire had slavery, egalitarian or not, whether like the free population was democratic or not. But like liberalism, with first you have like it's a long development. I mean, but Hobbes, right? Hobbes, Locke, they kind of really deal with this idea that like, well, humans are actually, when you think about it, kind of just like we're kind of equal. Like, I mean, yes, some are larger, some might have bigger brains or whatever, but like they're ultimately the same species. There's no real logical reason you can say people are unequal. And these ideas are just a bunch of like philosophers, but they kind of win politically over time with the bourgeois revolution. That's radical because before like the bourgeois revolutions, you had an aristocratic world where like if you were a peasant and if you were an aristocrat, you were a different human being. Like serfs, slaves, aristocrats were different humans. Like that's what people believed. Like,
everything was divinely ordained. Like if you were a peasant, you were because God created you to be a peasant. If you were a lord, you were created to be a lord. And anybody that tried to reverse that social order was condemned to hell.
Right. And yeah, that's where I do like kind of like to recognize the achievement of the bourgeois revolution, but also its limitation because you can't ultimately the thing that bourgeois revolution really like fails at is class. And I mean also realizing its own ideals, because like if you take its ideals, you would also end like racial discrimination. Like that's all people are created equal. And that's why they had to, in response to that, be like, oh wait, let's define what men are. Right. Like, they're not men, right? You know,
the thing about the bourgeoisie is that a lot of these people are lawyers and they're very, very good at creating loopholes for themselves. All men are created equal. Also, black people are not men.
Yeah, that's pretty much what they did. Like, but yeah, like a lot of the ones who took their shit seriously, and that's kind of where you get like real quote unquote liberalism, because all these bourgeois revolutions, none of them called themselves liberal at the time. It was only like after the French Revolution where people call themselves liberal. And that's when they're like, whoa, let's actually like extend this freedom to all people, right? Still not women. It takes quite a while. It's actually really the Soviets who are the first to give women rights. Like that's kind of what pressures the bourgeois countries to do that.
Never mind all of these countries ended up owning colonies. Like the French were literally among I think the British and the French are tied neck and neck for the worst colonizers.
Yeah.
Like Africa still hasn't recovered from what the French have done to it. Like they're still taking gold. They still have the CFA franc. They're thankfully our brothers in the Sahel have chased them out. But like France did some pretty fucked up shit. Like the guillotine people
reparations.
No, they don't want to pay. No, they're not paying any reparations. But
didn't they make them pay like reparations for like?
Oh, you mean
Haiti?
You mean they made Haiti pay reparations for freeing themselves. I think they had to pay all the way up until the 1910s or something like that. But yeah, that's like getting robbed and the judge saying that you have to pay your robber $50 a week.
I think to relate this is like the importance of history, right? It's not just like ivory tower discussion. It's important because like how do you deal with the conditions that exist, the material social conditions? You need to know the historical context. And I guess building communism requires that. I guess the last thing I would say is how important do you think it is to adapt to particular regional differences in the United States? Because America itself is a very diverse country, like the South, Midwest, the California, they all have their like different little cultures. I
Mhm.
know based on your experience, like how important do you think it is that communists adapt the way they approach activism to these particular contexts? Certain
Very,
things. Yeah.
very important. Like, for example, one that I could say that during the civil rights movement, okay, guns played a pretty major role. Like, if it wasn't for guns, we wouldn't have had the Civil Rights Act of 64. We wouldn't have had the Voting Rights Act of 65 because everybody who was actually organizing for those things would have been shot and killed. So a lot of those northern students who were coming from places like Chicago, New York City, Boston, a lot of these were upper middle class white kids from Harvard, University of Chicago, Northwestern, nice schools. So they go down there and they start trying to organize these people, and they're like, they're afraid of guns. They're like, why the fuck do you guys have all these guns? Like, because we're in the fucking South. What do you expect? We hunt, and we hunt animals, and we hunt crackers. So yeah, we got to keep our guns. And eventually, like, a lot of those people ended up being brought around to their point of view. It's like, yeah, I'm not going to go back to Chicago and buy a gun and carry it around with me, but in that particular context, the guns were useful. The deacons of defense were useful because the South has a gun culture. Both black and white owned guns. They hunted, they shot each other. Yeah, it's the wild South. So it's very important that we tailor ourselves and we adapt ourselves to the specific conditions of the area in which we're organizing. For example, if I were to go and organize in, say, Chicago or New York City, I would probably not be walking around on the streets with an AR-15. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't even do that in St. Louis because it's stupid and there's no need to do that. But that's just a wild example. But I would try to work and learn from the people that are from that city, people who have lived there, people who have been organizing there for decades, before I just show up with St. Louis isn't really a southern city. It's not really a northern city. It's definitely an eastern city. But like we're smack dab in the middle of the country, and we have traits of like pretty much every region. So I would not go there acting as if I'm still in St. Louis because I'm not. I'm in a bigger city. I'm in a city with a different culture. I'm in a city with a different demographic makeup. For example, St. Louis, we have a Hispanic community here, but it's not large. In Chicago, there are entire neighborhoods full of various types of Hispanic people, various types. Like shit, you've got a Puerto Rican neighborhood here, you've got a Mexican neighborhood here, you've got a Salvadorian block here, you've got a Nicaraguan block here, and never mind New York. So that's something you have to get accustomed to. And that's something that all communists would have to get accustomed to, because if you go to different areas of the country, like Mao was very particular about this, you have to respect the culture of different parts of China. You cannot try to impose great Han chauvinism on a Manchu part of the country or on a Tibetan part of the country, even though they fucked up Tibet. You cannot impose your views or your ethnic group's views on a part of the country where the population is majority Hispanic. For example, that a lot of Latino people are Catholic. So you have to respect that. You have to acknowledge that, yes, they're going to be going to church. Yes, they're going to have their santas. Yes, they're going to engage in things that Catholic people do. So you would not go to New Mexico or Texas and try to make those people atheists because they're probably going to laugh at you. So yeah, it's very important that we pay attention to stuff like that. That's also why, like, I really, really hate leftists who are basically militant atheists. Like, what exactly are you going to accomplish? You're not going to turn people away from their faith by yelling at them. You're just going to make them hate communists even more than they already do.
Glad you brought that up. because that's actually something I want to talk to you about in the back room, is like the kind of role between religion and communism, something I've been talking about a lot recently. I think it needs more thought, and also about various left tendencies. Kind of want to hear your takes on like Trotskyism, why you're not a Trotskyist,
I
left
was a trot
communism,
once.
MAGA communism, and also like the current state of the DSA and the situation with the current election and the Palestine situation. So yeah, without further ado, if you enjoyed this podcast, please give a 5-star rating. And if you want to hear the back room, you get access to probably 36, 38 episodes at this point, all exclusively on Patreon. We've been having some very interesting conversations on there lately. If you're not a patron already, you've been missing out. You're living under a rock. This is where all the cool people go, clearly. But yeah, thank you for being here, BRG, and give this gentleman a follow on Twitter, or X as it's called now. And I also check his YouTube channel. He has some videos. You haven't uploaded in a while. People are missing your videos, man.
I do streams now. There's like an entire panel of nothing but lives. But yes, I am going to try to start uploading like more old school type videos, because I know that's what you guys love.
Anyway, see y'all in the back room.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens, and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.